Thank you, Susanna. It's hard to believe 23 years ago when I won the Valcourt Farms competition. My career's never looked back since. Right, I'm going to talk to you about the challenges that are out there at the moment, which are creating risk in our rotation. I'm going to talk about some of the things we're doing to meet those challenges, i.e. to mitigate the risk that's out there when we're looking at rotation, and then give you a view of some of the where we think rotations will be in the future and what we would be looking to recommend you do. So the first of our challenges out there is that we've seen static or falling yields, and I think this is probably fairly well known, but it's emphasised in our data that we collect, Strutt & Parker. We have 130 farms where we collect the data of our yields, and it shows on this, hopefully you can see, yields on the left-hand side, an average of 9 tonnes a hectare over since 1999, since we've been collecting yields. And you can see the erratic nature of yields depending on the year. And then there's a slight line which shows a very gradual increase in yields, but generally for wheat, which is the number one cornerstone of most rotations, the yields are generally pretty flat lining at the moment, and that's a concern to us. And if we look at it in the case of differences just between this year and last year, and I don't know if you can read these figures, I hope you can. The top line shows 2016 yields for all of our farms, average yields, and 2015 is shown as well, and the difference in change. And you can see, particularly in a lot of the crops, yields were down on year, and compared to the 5-year average, they're down. But particular one I want you to note is, for us, was oilseed rape. Now, we have a lot of farms in East Anglia, but the impact of cabbage stem flea beetle taking our yields down for the first time below the national average at 2.9 tonnes a hectare. And that, as I'll show in a moment, is having a real serious impact on where we look and how we look at oilseed rape in the rotation. The one crop which we haven't got up here, but if we showed it, would be sugar beet, would be one that bucks the trend, and I'll say that in a moment, is that sugar beet, the trend line of yield is going upwards, but for many other crops they are flat, and with oilseed rape, big concern. So we've talked about static or falling yields. The other big issue is that we are having a real problem with weed, pest and disease resistance. And I'll give you a few examples here. Blackgrass, we know statistically, looking at our yields, that if you've got blackgrass, severe blackgrass, 500 plants per metre squared, you will half your yield. And in a lot of cases we've seen yields down to 5 tonnes a hectare where there's bad blackgrass in fields. Ryegrass, a particular issue in South Essex, North Kent, are becoming a real issue again, creating resistance, and we haven't got the chemistry there to change that. Cabbage stem flea beetle literally has come in as a major problem to parts of East Anglia in the last 2 years. 2 years ago, it was all about the adult flea beetle causing us problems. This last year, 2016 harvest, it was all about the larvae, which we couldn't do anything. There's no chemical control. But we were opening plants up in Essex, Cambridgeshire, and we were finding 30 to 50 larvae per plant, and it had a devastating effect on yields. And Septoria is the other one at the moment, where we're seeing we're using more and more triazoles earlier in the season in order to keep on top of Septoria being the particular one where there's a lot of disease issues, and we're having to look at variety change which has got good disease resistance. So we're also seeing a loss of pesticides, and pesticides being revoked. Statistically now, for every one new active ingredient we gain in the industry, we're losing 4, so 4 are being revoked. So the armoury we got, and in my days, in my lovely Valcourt days, I used to be able to get the solution out of a can. The solution's no longer there, and we're having to look at plant breeding, other techniques to really resolve the challenges that we've got out there. The other one that's sitting there, and it's a long-term, gradual, but it's an issue, and we're now really getting attuned to it, is this whole issue about reducing soil fertility, reducing organic matter, and there's no doubt there's a correlation between organic matter and soil resilience, and also to some extent yield as well. But that resilience to either be drought tolerant or tolerant to water as well, we're seeing that becoming a big issue. And fundamentally, which I'll show you later on, we're seeing increased costs of pesticides, having to use higher rates in a lot of cases to get the same effect. So that's increasing our variable costs, particularly as an element of fixed costs. And with static yields, we're definitely seeing a squeeze on profitability on the farm. So these are all the challenges. So what are we doing to mitigate the risk, to meet the challenges? Well, one of them we put on here is to maintain yields, but I would say in some cases improve the yields, but definitely where you're yielding well is to maintain a high line above the average. A wheat yield is going to be key. We have got to look to extend the rotation, and I'll come on to that in a minute. We've got to mitigate the cost, the ever-increasing cost of resistance, and we've got to somehow make sure we are improving soil health and structure. And that may be a combination of the things that we put down here, depending on the soil type. But definitely we're looking more at sludge, compost, of getting organic matters up, and then in some soil types looking definitely at cover crops. So, maintaining yield. Maintaining high yields is the key. Wheat, as we know, is the cornerstone of most people's rotation, combinable crop rotation. But we are going to have to accept that we're not going to be able to grow wheat as close in the rotation perhaps as we've been in the past, and I'll show you an example of where rotations are going. So it's going to be less intensive in the rotation, but that way hopefully we can maintain higher yields and hopefully also improve higher yields. Year-on-year consistency is the key. What we find is our top 10% producers of our 130 farms that we look at, those are ones that consistently hold good yields. They're above the average. They're doing all the things that I'm going to tell you about in a moment. And they tend to stick to that winning formula of how they do it. But it involves, in those farms also, it's not only, a lot of people say it's all to the soil, a lot of it is down to the management of the teams that are on the ground and actually really getting a good understanding of key agronomic issues. And in days gone by that was pure agronomy, but now it's looking much wider at soil management, soil status, plant counts, understanding the relation between yield maps to plant population, variable seed rates, and working out what gives you the optimum yield and ultimately optimum profitability in that whole rotation. So it is a management factor that goes into it as well. We are already seeing, when we talk about extending rotation, we're already seeing statistically the area of oilseed rape over the last 3 years has come down by nearly 100,000 hectares. And you can see that's been made up really by spring barley has increased, particularly malting barley, by around 75,000 hectares, and beans and peas also in there going up, with beans up by 50,000 hectares. So there's changes in the rotation. And what we're probably seeing on a typical heavy land farm, and hopefully you can read this, is that 5 years ago it would not have been uncommon to have a rotation that would have been 2 weeks an oilseed rape on a heavy land farm. With the issues of blackgrass, we are now definitely seeing more of a rotation that would bring in rape only being 1 year in 5, bring in possibly a double spring crop in order to control that blackgrass. So you may have spring barley after wheat and then spring beans in order to really get on top of blackgrass. We're also seeing, depending on the soil types, and we're definitely doing this on a number of our farms, introducing crops like sugar beet, reducing the oilseed rate, introducing combinable peas a lot more in order to go at least a 1 year in 5, but maybe a 1 year a 7-year rotation, but we are looking to add value to what we do. So a lot of the wheats will be milling wheats, the barley would almost certainly be malting barley, and we are just building in a resilience to the whole rotation so that we can get on top of, particularly in this case here, it would be blackgrass being the main scourge. And how does that impact on the gross margins of that particular farming business? What this graph shows you is the yellow bars show that if you did the 2-week and oilseed rape rotation, your average farm gross margin on our 5-year average yields would be £70 a hectare better than if you did the 5-year rotation. But of course, what you have to take into account, and I showed you the fall in yield on oilseed rape in 2016, is that actually the truth of it, if you carried on doing a 2-week rape rotation, your costs of blackgrass control will keep going up. So extending the rotation, hopefully you're getting a reasonable variable cost spend, and actually, although on a basis you look, in theory you're £70 a hectare worse off, in practice that margin would be much closer because you'd be lower herbicide costs, you're hopefully higher yields because your rape's less in the rotation, all of these factors. So extending the rotation does in practice make economic sense. So what are the challenges extending the rotation? I know for a lot of farms, particularly heavy land farms, it is the issue, and I've been through where there's definitely a scourge to be put in many spring crops in, particularly, but we have to be aware that this is going to be an absolute key if we're going to get on top of things like blackgrass, ryegrass in the future. So, but it is key that we get it. Do the cultivations right, we're cultivating early dry, and we are making the most of the conditions to make sure actually what our spring barley yields would show is actually our spring barley yields have gone up over the last 3 years, and that's really because we've learnt how to really get spring barley in well into good conditions and optimise the yields. Just to show you what the cost of resistance is, this is a good example of the different costs of the main products that you would see between 2006 and 2016 of things like metazoclor, butazan, curb, laser, you've got Liberator, Crystal, and if you look on the right hand side, the percentage change, most of them are significantly up in their costs. So things like Crystal over that 10-year period, price to Crystal up 71% in terms of what it was 2006. So some significant changes and expense in cost. And I'll show you that as a little case study of a farm in Bedfordshire of those costs. So costs are up, and we've got less products. So that does mean we are going to have to change, and we have to go to much more cultural things, which I'm sure you're aware of, we're all aware of. Later drilling, less winter cropping, possibly potentially fallowing, and we have to be brave where we do have a blackgrass issue, possible destruction of the crop in June, where we spray out patches in wheat crops. So these are the things that we are going to have to do to meet grass weed resistance. With Cambridgetown flea beetle, it's realistically probably growing less rape in the rotation, and where septoria resistance, it is definitely a case. I think the number one is choosing varieties that have good disease resistance inherently built into them is a factor, but also we're seeing that that we're having to bring in, be much more protective in our approach rather than trying to do the old curative approach of looking at septoria. But these are all adding to costs and squeezing the margins if we don't do it correctly. An example I give of just to show of a Bedfordshire farmer. We've got Bedfordshire farm, and these are the costs typically of controlling blackgrass in wheat and oilseed rape. And you can see over the period of a 5-year period that the average spend has gone up from £65 a hectare in wheat to £134 a hectare, and in oilseed rape it's gone from £72 a hectare to £103. So an additional cost on average of £52 a hectare on herbicides alone in that time where we got problematic blackgrass. So you can see this issue of why we have to extend the rotation. When we look at varieties, we are now, and particularly on breeding, and this is just an example, we're not only just looking at the treated yields as we would have in the past, we look much closely at the untreated yields. What's their tolerance, particularly to things like septoria resistance being the expensive one to control. It's interesting, I was a talk with CMI, some of you might know, and they were saying that the difference between a 7 resistance and a 4 is a saving on 60% on fungicides alone between those differences on the sort of NIAB list if you were doing expenditure. But this just shows you where you're looking at varieties because of their untreated yields. So, looking at rotations in the future, well, clearly we've still got to get yield, and it must be a profitable rotation. We've got to look at ways we reduce costs, so mitigating that big expenditure on resistant blackgrass or whatever. So, where we're looking at yield, it's adding value, it's bringing in new crops, so sugar beet, perhaps replacing oilseed rape. Looking at variety selection is absolutely key, making sure we got good disease resistance in the variety. The rotation has to be sustainable, and we must make sure we deal with all the resistance problems that are out there. Soil management is becoming a key influence to profitability, and we are definitely looking at investing into bringing more organic matter into our soils, as I say, through sludge, farm manure, digestates, whatever we can. And where people have done that, they've made a huge difference to not only is what we would call soil resilience, so it's making them more drought tolerant and also making them more tolerant to actually very wet conditions, so they're more workable even in very wet conditions. They're less likely to get compacted. All of those factors that go in, which make it important to reducing the build-up of resistant weeds particularly. We are going to see undoubtedly less winter crops being sown. There'll be a move to spring crops. We're going to see trying to get consistency. In the old days, we would have looked at bigger areas, but I think we'll be looking much more at getting fields, choosing varieties, choosing cropping to the field and the relation to the field that we've got. We may well be bringing more and more double spring crops in there to really get on top of resistance. And we may not grow winter cereal after a break crop. What we would also say, perhaps controversially to some people in the room, is we don't think any one cultivation regime is the answer. It's likely to be a combination of the list we got there. Bringing probably a plough still in the rotation occasional other direct drilling perhaps as well. We think there'll be a combination. So, how are things going to be de-risked? So we will be looking at higher drilling capacity. And probably higher seed rates, particularly in winter cereals, but we're going to need to have that capacity, one, to drill in a shorter window for winter crops, and also be capable of spring drilling. We've got to focus on the appropriate cultivations for spring crops to mitigate weather extremes, wider rotation, reduce the frequency of oilseed rape in the rotation. We're going to see resilience of soils I've talked about. Variety selection is going to be a key to make sure we get on top of disease pressure. And finally, this team training to make sure we've got the right management skills to really understand what's going on, particularly with all the technology of precision farming, making sure we know what's going on. That's me covered. I have got, just to say, if anyone wants particularly to see the slides, I have got 1 or 2 memory sticks. Come and see me at our stand afterwards, but thank you very much.